we are honored to have Dr. Jessica Cherry as our first speaker in the series. Dr. Cherry is a research assistant, or a research scientist and assistant professor here at University of Alaska Fairbanks and a commercial instrument-rated pilot. She earned her bachelor's, master's, and PhD at Columbia University in New York City. She leads a hydroclimatology group at UAF and was a finalist for the 2013 NASA astronaut class. She has served as a mission pilot for NASA's CARVE program and participated in science flying missions for numerous government agencies. Did we want to do questions during your presentation or after?
Sure, we can take them during.
Okay, so we're going to have questions open throughout the entire presentation. So if you have a question, just raise your hand. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jessica Cherry.
Well, thanks so much for coming, everyone. And yeah, it's a small group. We might as well keep this informal. So if you have a question that comes up, let me know. So tonight I just wanted to talk a little bit about airborne research in Alaska. And when I was thinking of a kind of a theme of the talk, I thought, well, maybe the science of risk and the risk in science might be a good one. There's sort of inherent risk, of course, in flying airplanes, but also in just about everything we do. And also as a climate scientist, we think a lot about risk in the future and how we can quantify that and plan for it. So just wanted to start with this photo. And is it possible to dim the front lights a little bit so these images are easier to see? I wanted you to take a look at this photo, and it's sort of randomly selected from my collection, but I wanted you to think a little bit about the power of imagery for helping us as a way of knowing things. And so here's a picture from the Minto Flats area, kind of northwest of Fairbanks or so. You see that all right? And so maybe you could just take a look at the photo and tell me what you see. What do your eyes tell you about this environment that we're looking at? For example, I see that it's fall because the leaves have changed colors. And even though this is a very flat area and you might think would be sort of dominated by very cold conditions and shallow permafrost, you have deciduous trees growing. So even though it's a swampy area, you would think it's swampy because it's underlain by permafrost, and yet there's deciduous trees growing. I see the airplane reflected in the water. And one thing in this area you see a lot is oil slicks on the water from probably from natural seepage out in the Minto area. And you see that the vegetation below the water is continuous with that on shore. So this is probably an area where the water kind of comes and goes on a seasonal cycle. It might be drier some years and wetter others. So those are the kind of things that I think are interesting that you see in imagery that you wouldn't necessarily hypothesize about in advance. And in fact, the scientific method is generally that we hypothesize something, we test it, and then we discover the results of our testing and whether it confirms our hypothesis or denies it. And on the other hand, I think there's a different type of way of knowing and of learning that comes from exploring. And we all know what it's like to explore something. And I would love to see that is part of the scientific process. And one problem is it's just hard to, in a culture now that's driven by grants and contracts, and writing those exploration things into the process is becoming increasingly difficult. But I think it's very important, and so I think that's a critical part of being a scientist, and I hope to always hold on to that spirit of exploration. So tonight I just wanted to tell you a little bit about me and my experience and how that led me to get into science flying, and then I'll describe what that is and what I'm doing with aviation, and then kind of where I hope to go with it potentially. So I grew up here in this very flat place where we have a fairly strong connection to the environment. It's a farming community. It's a place where the weather is extreme, not as extreme as here, but you feel it. And then what I did is when I was 18, I moved here, which was equally intense in a lot of ways, and but also fascinating. And I got interested in the idea of sustainability with relation to the environment, and just how, as a society, we were going to sort that out in our rural communities, which are, of course, changing very quickly, as well as our urban communities. Over that kind of 15-year period since I left home, there's been a huge urbanization movement among young people, and that's been an interesting transformation. Later in my college years, and I ended up studying economics and environmental science, and I was interested in this sustainability idea. I got a little burned out on the big city, so I moved here, which is a completely different environment. So this is the Biosphere 2 project, which was down in Arizona, and at the time was managed by my university for about 10 years. And you probably heard about this in the news. In the early 90s, it was a closed experiment, and so a group of investors, Ed Bass of the Bass oil family was the main bankroller for this project, and there was an interesting group of individuals who essentially had this vision that they wanted to build a Mars colony prototype in Arizona. And people had this idea before, but had never built a $200 million facility to do it. So this is a pretty unbelievable place, and it was a really interesting. So what my university did was, after the initial experiment where the facility was closed for first a 2-year experiment, and then they started a second 2-year experiment that went awry when they ran out of oxygen. So they ended that experiment. And it turned out the reason that happened, they got all these Columbia scientists together and they tried to figure out why on earth did we run out of oxygen in this facility. And one of the graduate students involved, his dad was a construction contractor, and he said, well, you put a bunch of concrete inside and it absorbed the oxygen. It oxidized. So that's what happened. But I think the Biosphere 2 is a really good example of a vision that someone had, and a lot of people thought that these folks were pretty crazy, which they might have been. The kind of the cult of personality behind the facility was this guy, John Allen, who has a pen name of Johnny Dolphin, who has written plays and poems and is quite a character. He had a theater troupe in Fort Worth, Texas, called the Caravan of Dreams, and kind of harvested from that group of folks to be part of this Biosphere experience. So it was really a strange story, but I think a good one for thinking about the types of people that are willing to take risks and how they're considered kind of crazy. But at the end of this, I'll talk about how quickly the private space industry is blossoming right now, and a lot of the folks that were actually part of that original Biosphere experiment are now run private space industries and are involved in what's going on with Virgin Galactic and some of these other companies. So, but what John Allen did with his crew of Biospherians to train them for their experience was something even riskier. He took them out on this boat, which he had, I think, custom made for this, called the Heraclitus, after the philosopher and historian. And It's called a junk, the type of boat, and it was an isolated environment in which people had to cooperate to survive, and of course is rather risky going to sea and needing to plan your resources and watch the weather and a lot of things that are not unlike any other kind of exploration adventure, be it in space or a prototype or whatnot. I was interested in that idea, so I spent another semester away from college doing this, which was pretty neat. I was part of the Sea Education Association. I learned how to sail this schooner and kind of got the sense of what it was like to be isolated for 6 weeks out in the ocean. And this was before we had internet on ships and things like that, and that was a great experience. So what we did was we left from Woods Hole, Massachusetts in early October, and then transited down to the coast of Venezuela, right where that colorful thing was spinning around. And that was also quite an adventure. So we sailed through Hurricane Mitch, which was a very damaging earthquake where a lot of people were killed at sea and in Honduras where it made landfall, and gave us an appreciation for, we were not just out having an educational experience, we were really actually risking our lives doing that, and that was a bit of a wake-up call. So I got back to college, I finished up, or actually my last semester, I decided that maybe it was time for a relaxing desk job. So I signed up to work on Wall Street for about a year. Actually, one of my sailing buddies sailed one of these little boats called the Petrel, which was formerly owned by JFK Jr., who also met his demise in a small aircraft. Anyway, it turns out Wall Street was not the place to be in those years. And so I went to graduate school, and I got to go to sea again. I got my master's in physical oceanography, and I ended up going northward then and sailing all over the Arctic. I've been to every Arctic sea, and that was really neat. But I decided that being an oceanographer was also really challenging, trying to find the amount of money it takes to run a ship, which is something like $20,000 a day to run a big research vessel, and that sounded difficult to start your career with that kind of obstacle. So I ended up switching over to climate and hydrology, and I came up to Alaska for my first job as a postdoc. And I started managing these networks of weather stations, and that's still what I do. I've got a network of sensors that measure weather and climate and snow, going from Fairbanks here all the way up to Barrow, and then another set of stations out in the Seward Peninsula and the Nome area. And that was a lot of fun, and still is. But being out in the field and transiting those areas, I really got an appreciation for how large Alaska is. And so I decided I wanted to learn to fly. And I had a project to do up in Umiat, which is on the north slope of Alaska, and I've been flying off and on with a couple different instructors for about 40 hours before I soloed, and I ended up soloing at Umiat, which probably was never been done and will never be done again. But Umiat is actually a really pretty place up on the Colville, and is also the center of a lot of activity this summer and the last few summers because there's a proposed road. Looks like it is probably going forward. And of course, we've known there have been oil and gas resources in the Umiat area since the 40s and 50s. There's been exploration up there. But in terms of again, getting back to this theme of science of risk, a lot of what we do in climate and hydrology especially is trying to think about what our engineering standards need to be for roads and bridges, and think about the risks of a 10-year flood and a 100-year flood, and what we've just seen in Galena. Some events you can plan for and engineer for, and some are just too costly to do so. So it's an interesting thing to think about in terms of of climate change and how our assumptions about the past may not carry into the future. But seeing the state by air, I was really hooked, and so I ended up continuing getting my instrument and commercial rating, and also figuring out a way to fly for science. And that was in part because what a neat thing to do, and in part, of course, because it pays the gas bill. So I developed some payloads for different aircraft. These are conventional aircraft. This funny-looking one here on the bottom, I flew very briefly for a NASA mission that was subsequently canceled, unfortunately. But that was a really neat experience. And that funny plane has a carbon sniffer on the front and a methane sniffer on the strut on the side there, and is uniquely set up with a pusher prop so that the exhaust from the plane doesn't make its way into the sensors. The other planes I've set up to take downward looking and oblique photography. And I've also gotten the opportunity to be involved in some unmanned systems. I'll tell you a little bit more about the project with that little scout towards the end here. I had a project with Alaska Aerospace to talk about how they might use these kind of citation-sized, business jet-sized unmanned systems called the Global Hawk. With some of my students, I've worked with radiosondes, weather balloons, and tether sondes. And these all have good applications that are sometimes easier to use than a conventional aircraft and sometimes harder. So they all have their things they're good for. And some of the things that we fly, I'm going to show you examples of, but they include the kind of cameras you're used to that take photos on the red, green, and blue bands, cameras that measure thermal infrared, cameras that actually operate in the microwave frequency and tell us something about what's below the surface, and then other cameras that take measurements in other parts of the electromagnetic spectrum and can tell us things about stressed vegetation and answer other scientific questions. I also have a meteorological package that's measuring temperature and humidity and pressure. And then we've also integrated a laser spectrometer, and that's something that can measure isotopes, which are chemical signatures that we can trace through various environmental systems. And then I mentioned that carbon and methane flux system. So we're kind of well positioned to do a lot of different kind of scientific investigations with with the infrastructure we put together here. Since I'm primarily a hydrologist and a climatologist, I'm going to just show you some examples of applications related to that I've been thinking about. And again, I think that sometimes these pictures really speak for themselves. So I've focused on pretty pictures. So this one is from a couple years ago down in the Tanana Flat, south of town. It was a really wet June, and this is, I think, just at the end of June. And so you can see that, or maybe even early July, it's very green. And these are shrubs. We're flying about 1,500 feet off the ground. So these are not even full-grown trees. And the surface is completely inundated with water. And what you can see are these patterns coming out in the surface of kind of patterns of geomorphology. And I'm not even sure whether these are being caused by frozen ground processes or animals running back and forth over the surface, if they're made up of trails, but they're all over this permafrost-dominated landscape, and they're really interesting. And so I think some of my colleagues in the room are working on developing models of hydrologic interaction with vegetation and showing how water routes itself over the surface and how that changes as we get warming and that soil starts to thaw and slump. And And if we can't even see, because these are really difficult to see in the ground, if we can't even see those features that are there, then we don't know to put them into our models. And so I think that at this scale, you can see things that you can't see on the ground, but you also can't see from the satellites. And so that's where I think airborne imagery is really powerful. One of the things that we think a lot about here in the state are how lakes are changing, and that's partly because a lot of communities depend on surface water for water supplies. And again, as the climate changes and soil thaws, some of that surface water can get pulled down into the subsurface, and then it may not be available for community water supplies or for animals to drink or other things. So we're interested in whether lakes and surface waters are disappearing or in some places appearing. And so here's, again, out, I think in the Minto Flats area. This is maybe even an old oxbow off of the river there. So we're interested in how those features come and go and why. And one of the tools that I've been learning how to use are the thermal infrared imagery. So this is the conventional camera with the red, blue, green all together, and then here's the same image in the thermal infrared. And so, sorry, I don't have a color bar up here, but I think that's between the green and the red, about 2 degrees Celsius difference in temperature. And so when we're thinking about the energy balance on these areas and how that affects whether they're drying up because they're evaporating or increasing in size because it's precipitating more, and how they reflect sun and absorb sun and those things, that these microclimate observations are actually pretty useful. There's also some tricks we can play with data analysis of time-lapse photography, and there's so much neat stuff happening with time-lapse photography right now. I think it's really exciting. You can see a lot of neat environmental applications on the internet and a lot of other fun things, time-lapse photography. But if you look at the way surface water freezes up and thaws out, you can also learn something about how deep the water is in that lake without having to go out and measure it. And so that's been a body of rich research at UAF here over the years since the 70s. And one of the tools is using this synthetic aperture radar, which again is in that microwave spectrum from satellite generally. But we have a unit that fits on an airplane or an unmanned system. And so our hope is that that will help us learn more about some of these smaller scale lakes. We can also use airborne imagery to tell us something about geothermal development. Of course, there's a lot of risk associated with big economic investments in infrastructure that we hope are going to be used to help generate power and heat. And so the Pilgrim Hot Springs out on the Seward Peninsula has been probed the last few years as to whether that's a good candidate for developing low temperature, so again, kind of economically marginal geothermal power. And so my colleague Matt Nolan and his wife, who's they're both pilots now actually, went out and flew this, and then we came back in the spring and did another survey. And here's just an oblique shot to show you what it looks like in the winter. But even in the winter conditions, you can see these temperature gradients. You can see the old Pilgrim Hot Springs kind of development site, and that's a real hot spot for expression of the groundwater in those hot springs. We're also interested in overflow ice. It's not just inconvenient for winter travel. It also tells us about sometimes groundwater coming up, and it's warmer, and that's why it's forming overflow. This is for a flight we did for a student who is looking at the role of dangerous ice in subsistence travel. So that's been a neat project. We're also interested in water vapor in the air, and we did this nice my colleague Pat Harmon produced this film with me where we actually made the aircraft itself kind of into a weather balloon, and we flew it around, and one of my master students was trying to ask the question about in the shoulder seasons, in fall and spring, what are the processes that help dissipate that inversion that we all know is pretty bad air quality for Fairbanks. So she sat at the airport, and you can see there's some jagged squiggly lines. Those are the color is mapped to temperature, and those are weather balloons that she released at the airport while we went out and kind of probed in the 3D the temperature profiles in this area. So that's been playing on the Alaska Weather Show as a short segment for the last year or so. I mentioned isotopes are really great for being able to trace where water comes from and goes to in the global water cycle. And this is something that actually does get measured by satellite as well, or has for the last few years. But a lot of measurements from satellite have no way of being calibrated or validated because there's nothing else that flies in a profile through the atmosphere. And so we've been working with NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab to calibrate this sensor by putting that spectrometer in the back of an airplane. So that's been another really neat project, and we're going to keep doing that all summer up on the North Slope as well. Another application that people are really interested in is how is methane and carbon fluxing out of surface waters, and how does that relate to global warming, both as an effect and a cause. And so, again, with one of my colleagues asked me to take these photos for her, looking at really this is from out in Goldstream Valley. The very first day that ice forms on the lakes in about October, before much snow falls, you can see these heat plumes stuck under the ice or sometimes burning through the ice, like you can see in the optical one there. And that's what we anticipate is methane coming out of those ponds. So you could think about trying to kind of quantify, you see this many bubbles, and maybe you can come to an estimate on the flux happening at that time. So that's pretty neat work. Also staying with the biogeochemistry theme, I mentioned that carbon methane sniffing plane for NASA. We flew that out. This was a test flight out in the Bonanza long-term ecological research area. And it's a little hard to see this map, but the BZNT, those are the Bonanza site. And so out along the river between here and Inanna, we were flying and looking for these methane plumes, which really showed up pretty strongly. Up in Barrow, I've been working with the Department of Energy on a project looking at, working with a very large group of modelers who want to think about how the terrain is going to evolve in the high Arctic under climate change. And so one thing we did was we went up and flew the Barrow Environmental Observatory area, and some very bad weather. So we have some gaps in this. This is about 7,000 images in this mosaic, and flew at about 300 feet, and there's still some kind of clouds a little bit in this image, but we've got about 4 centimeters resolution from a camera that is pretty much an off-the-shelf consumer-grade camera. So that's pretty neat. That really makes this kind of research affordable, that you could have such a high-resolution image over a relatively large area at a relatively low cost. And the real challenge on some of this is the data processing end of it. So that's where some of the hardware is a little bit ahead of the software. But there are emerging softwares that use some pretty sophisticated computer vision techniques to automatically mosaic these images together. And so, and I think Microsoft has a free online version called PhotoSynth that you can load in your photos that you take. And what it does is it will use the pixels in the images and use that to generate a point cloud and then match tie points between images. And sometimes you can specify those manually, or it can do it automatically. The fancier softwares will then not just give you a mosaic of all your images, but will also use it to generate a three-dimensional surface. So that's pretty cool. That's again makes affordable a technology that would normally cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to get a digital elevation map for areas that people are interested in, can now be done with a simple consumer-grade camera, essentially. So I've been playing around a bit with this. Here's a 3D model I made. A little bit hard to see with the lights here, but this is of the Tetlin River area down near Tok, and that was related to a project I did with my colleagues Olga Levick and Patrick Harmon. Again, we made a short film on, it's called Waterways, and it had to do with the language, culture, and the environment in the Upper Tanana. Olga is a linguist, and Patrick is our media guru, and we wanted to interview some of the elders. Olga's been working in Tetlin for a very long time with this amazing storyteller, Cora David, who still speaks the Upper Tanana dialect from Tetlin. And Olga's got a really nice book. Should have brought a copy here. And so what we did was just link some of the features of the annual subsistence cycle to the language, to the theme of water. And if you've been to Tetlin or Tok, it's a very water-inundated part of the state, and it's really a water-dominated culture. And I thought that was really interesting. And that will be available from the Language Center here on their website very shortly. Snow and ice mapping are kind of closest to my interest in some ways. I consider myself sort of a snow person. And there's a lot of neat applications in the state. Here's, again, a couple of flight lines. And so the blue squares are kind of where the image was taken, and the line goes through the center point that goes down to the surface. And so if you can imagine, those are the camera frames moving through, and these are just two flight lines. And what we've done is out in this research area north of town, Caribou Poker Creek Research Watershed, we did these snow surveys, and there are enough trees out there instead of a completely white surface, so we were able to start to generate these three-dimensional surfaces from just the 2D imagery. And what we're trying to do then is link snow depletion to river runoff using hydrologic models. So that's one of my PhD student projects that she's working on. Kind of the last case study I wanted to talk about was this experience I had out in Nome about a year and a half ago. I got the opportunity to fly this little quadcopter for the Coast Guard Healy Renda tanker fuel delivery situation. So if you're not from Alaska or you weren't around then, in January, a year and a half ago, the Coast Guard and the community of Nome and its Native Corporation made the decision to charter a midwinter fuel delivery using a Russian tanker called the Renda. And they asked the Coast Guard icebreaker Healy to escort the tanker, which was not ice strengthened, into the Nome harbor. And this was a complete media circus. But I think it was a completely fascinating experience. And what we did was fly this. I'll show this. So here's the Renda and the Healy on their way to Nome. And the idea was that we would go in as a group and fly this drone to take pictures of the ice ridges. This little image in the upper right-hand corner there shows the jetty in the harbor, and then you can see their ice ridges packed up. And at some point, the Healy has a pretty deep draft, and so the tanker was going to have to make its way into the harbor basically on its own, or as far as it could get, to anchor itself to the land-fast ice that's frozen to the ground to secure itself so they could unload the fuel. Very risky, and there are all kinds of questions about why was this necessary, why could it not have been flown in like it is for most communities, and there are a lot of interesting questions that went on, and so we used the drone, we generated this, the map, and the idea was that was going to help, information was going to help mitigate some of the risk of this expedition. And I was asked to come in because the FAA is still in the process of deciding how to regulate drones, and that's a very hot topic locally, but all over the country. And we have a very active drone research group here headed by Greg Walker. And so what's required in unrestricted airspace, the FAA needs to issue a certificate of authorization for you to operate a drone. And so we were given an emergency authorization on the condition that it was flown by a licensed pilot, and so a commercial pilot. So they asked me to come in at the last minute, and that was a really neat experience. And so here is what the Incident Command Forward Operating Base in Nome looked like, and that's the mayor, Mayor Denise, I can't remember her last name, but and it was fascinating. The Coast Guard folks were all up front. Community members and other people involved somehow were in the back, and it was pretty clear that it was taking the ships a long time to get there. It was very heavy ice conditions, and when I got there, they were thinking that the ships would be in within 48 hours, and it turned out to be a whole week of kind of waiting as they were laboring to get themselves here. And at the point that the woman who's the captain of the Coast Guard Healy, could hear her on the teleconferences, she was absolutely mentally exhausted by this whole situation, and it was very unclear. No one had done any quantification of really whether or not it was going to work once they got to Nome. And there was only so much hose available in the community, and only so much pressure to get that oil into the local holding tank. So why would the Coast Guard agree to this incredible feat? And there were a lot of folks thinking that this is about the opening of the Arctic, we're trying to show that we have the infrastructure that we can operate year-round in the Arctic because of the new thin ice conditions. And from my vantage point, at least, it looked very uncertain. And at the last minute, they ended up bringing in a more experienced captain into the Healy, and that was a big media blitz. It was very interesting, but it worked. They did it. They delivered it. Whether or not it was necessary, whether it was a show of force by someone, I don't know. It was really cool to be a part of this and have this kind of insider's view, though. And that's kind of what I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about the science of risk, and especially in this new environment of a globally changed world. So I just wanted to finish up with a couple of slides on what is next. Ariel mentioned that I got the really interesting experience last couple of years to go through the NASA astronaut selection process. In fact, my classmates that I interviewed with are going to find out tomorrow whether they got picked or not. So I was not selected, and I was told that about a month ago. But it's a really interesting time to be keen on space, because things are really changing. During the shuttle era, the shuttle was a really big part of American culture. It was risky. It was not safe, and a lot of people died in this program for reasons that somewhere between ignorance and negligence, probably. But it was an interesting program, and it took a lot of risks, and really cool time-lapse photos. The LA Times did the whole transit of bringing the Endeavour from Edwards, I think, into downtown LA, and they had to cut down a bunch of trees, and it is a really neat video. I encourage you to find that on the internet. But what's really happening now is that the folks that are really pushing the envelope are the private sector, and so I found out this week that I applied and have been accepted as an astronaut candidate for a private company called Astronauts for Hire. It's like a very direct title. So Astronauts for Hire is going to train us. We're going to go through basically the same training as the NASA folks do, but kind of on our own time, and we get to keep our day jobs. So this might be an interesting experience. This is not a science fiction picture. This is actually Virgin Galactic Spaceport in New Mexico, and they have 9 others under construction right now around the world. So it's not, I don't think it's really a fantasy. I think this is happening. People paid a lot of money to go on these space tourist flights now, and they're saying they're going to fly next year. So we'll see if it happens. But it's neat to see people taking risks, and people really, sometimes it's harder for government agencies to take those kind of risks than the private sector to really push it. And I think the future is going to be about partnerships between the government and the private sector making that happen. So I am very honored to get a chance to see the inside of that future too. So at this point, I welcome your questions and comments. Thank you. Betty, you're in the front.
Dr. Jerry, have you been able to do any flyovers to the interior close to Fairbanks to look at the movement of permafrost water surface water?
We have done quite a few flights here in the Fairbanks area. We had a multi-purpose campaign last summer, and it was actually commissioned by someone that was interested in tracking moose habitat, and that scientist, Todd Brinkman, hypothesized, he's been working with a group of subsistence hunters who've claimed that the warmer autumns have caused the moose to be harder to find because maybe they are hanging out in places that are cooler, like in the water or under trees or things, and so they're harder for hunters to find. So he was interested in testing that hypothesis. Are the moose, where do they hang out in the local microclimate? And so we first went out and tried to find moose and take their picture with the thermal camera, and that was relatively hard. They don't stand out unless you kind of already know what you're looking for in terms of their thermal signature during the kind of late summer period. In the winter, they stick out pretty well. And I did another study as a prototype for the State Trooper Search and Rescue to show that we could find live bodies in the snow with this thermal camera without being able to see them with our eyes. And so we used moose for that. They were handy. They were there already. And so in taking all these pictures of the microclimate of the Tanana Flats here, we are starting to get a sense of the temperature gradients in that environment. And I think modeling the hydrology will be the next step in that. I have a guy coming up here from Chapel Hill, UC North Carolina, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, he's part of a campaign that's looking at water inundation using the microwave part of the spectrum. And this is a prototype for a satellite that's flying on a really big plane. And he wants to come and do some small plane experiments with, you know, it's much cheaper to fly a small plane than it is a Boeing-size plane for this kind of research flights, although they are doing that. And so we're going to be flying up and down the Tanana this summer.
So we're looking at the increase or decrease of the bogs in the area?
Yeah, that's one of this investigator, his name is Tamlin Pavelski, one of his interests is exactly that question.
What was her question?
Her question is about, whether lakes and bogs are increasing or decreasing in the area. And when you look at any kind of imagery that's time-lapse, you always have to ask yourself the question, what are the drivers behind that change? If you're trying to detect the change, is it because the preceding climate was different, like it rained a bunch that summer, or that the thermal effects of thermal erosion are contributing to the slumping in those low gradient type watersheds? It's a good question.
So when you're looking at snow melt to, I noticed, to ice flow, can you tell anything about the Yukon River's breakup?
I would like very much to. I think we're going to put in a proposal. I work pretty closely with the River Forecast Center in Anchorage, and they do have a pilot observers program, and those of you who are pilots may be interested in getting involved if you're not already. They have a pamphlet at the Flight Service Center, and the Weather Service here will train you on how to observe the river from the air, and they'll show you how to describe the ice according to their system so that they can add those observations into their prediction system. And I think folks have talked about wanting to do that from unmanned systems. The problem with using satellite imagery is that in the springtime during breakup, there's so much moisture in the air that there are a lot of clouds, and the satellites can't really see through that, at least the optical ones. And then once you're really starting to look also at small-scale features about the thickness of ice and whether it's packed up and whether it's doing a thermal breakup or a dynamic breakup, and that's just a lot easier to see from an airplane than it is from a satellite. So I would love to be able to do that. Like a lot of these very weather-sensitive airborne campaigns, it's hard to plan your life around when breakup's going to happen. Anyone who bought Ice Classic tickets this year knows that it was not a good year to be betting on Mother Nature. And so that's the challenge with these very time-sensitive campaigns, is how to plan that and budget it and basically have an aircraft and a pilot waiting and ready to head out. But I'm hoping to put together a proposal with a colleague that has one of these microwave sensors in the proper spectra that'll be useful for estimating that ice thickness without having to go and take a bunch of manual measurements. And we're hoping we can do better for these communities along the Yukon that have really suffered the last few years. And we have programs where the folks from the Department of Agriculture go out and they take snow measurements, called the SNOTEL program, the Snow Course program. And so what the River Forecast Center has in front of them is basically just an estimate in a few watersheds of about how much snow water equivalent is in there. That's what they call the amount of moisture in that snowpack. And the problem is the Yukon is huge. It starts in Canada, so you have to share data between countries. There were a whole bunch of budget cuts to the feds this year, so as part of the sequester, they could not go out and measure as much snow as they normally do. They knew there was a heavy snowpack in the Yukon, but did they know it was going to flood Galena Well, no, and it was very little notice for that community, and it's just gone. Just gone. It's really sad. Well, if I could keep people from flooding villages, that would be even better. But yeah, I think it would be nice to at least give people more notice so that they could prepare their community, and that's what we're going for. If we could mitigate the risk if we can have people have 4 days notice instead of a day's notice or 3 hours notice or something to get people into boats and out or onto the plane if the runway is going to make it. So.
Maybe you could divulge a little bit more about this astronauts for hire. Is this to manned craft that are built by other countries that don't have the expertise to fly them, or what are some of the goals for this project?
So I will be finding out more, I guess, as I get along in the process. But the general idea is that the number of folks that are NASA trained were astronauts in the shuttle era. That number has declined precipitously, and a lot of them have the kind of health problems that you get when you come back from space, where your vision goes bad, your problems with your shoulders because you've been out with your spacesuit and it's really hard on your shoulder. All these health effects that make it so that they're not qualified to fly, even though they have a lot of experience. And at the same time, NASA's had so few astronaut recruitments that there's probably a personnel shortage. Even though because of the sequester, they're just going to take 8 people this year. Back in the shuttle era, they were taking 30 people in these classes, and the reason is right now we don't have a vehicle. So the U.S. astronauts from NASA are going up in the Russian Soyuz capsule, and NASA's plan for their next system is a capsule again. It's using rockets and not a shuttle type design, but as NASA put out their call for new designs, which did go out to the private sector, there were 3 companies that NASA has under contract to design new vehicles. And the goals of those would be to resupply the space station. And one of those, I think it was the Blue Origin, did have their first flight last October, and so that was an unmanned flight. Their rocket took off, and the vehicle docked in the space station and made an unmanned delivery of supplies. There are 2 other companies under contract with NASA to develop similar type systems. So it's a competitive process. They're trying to work more with the private sector. But the folks who are running these companies don't have access to all the NASA facilities and the millions of dollars a year it takes to train NASA astronauts. So this is the first company, this Astronauts for Hire, to break off, and their pitch is that they will do the training and they will have this body of people available that don't have all the constraints of the federal government to allocate all those funds to keep people on staff sitting in a cubicle in Houston until 12 years later when they get their chance to fly. So it's a different business model for astronauts. So we'll see. Big risk. Question of the here?
Where would you like to go?
You know, we have not been to the moon since 1972. And that's pretty sad.
Go visit all those people that are up there.
Exactly. Check out all the real estate that's been sold there. Question in the back.
Would you like us to?
You found some ice cream. Sure. Who wants an ice popsicle? Thank you. I promised some people ice cream, and so it's very nice that she got some ice cream. In the back here?
Documenting any global warming changes up here, or are they going to help document changes that happen to the landscape when the road goes through?
I hope so. a lot of challenges. Of course, there are a lot of changes that occur because of reasons other than climate change. And so build a road and it causes slumping on the side, and people drive their caterpillars across the tundra and that causes damage. And there are a lot of complex effects with warming, changing vegetation, and vegetation trapping more snow and causing other changes down the line. It takes a very long observational record to be able to attribute each change to what's causing it. And I am fairly conservative in that sense. I think that a lot of change is actually normal variation, and so separating that from human-induced change, either globally or locally, I think can be tricky. The problem with our satellite record is that it's pretty short, and satellite sensors come and go, and there's a problem with consistency because of just the enormous cost of that. We have some incredible resources here at UAF in the Geodata Center. We have a lot of historical photos from aircraft starting back in the 50s. So we have access to a lot of photos that can be used for change detection that don't exist other places, but they're kind of sparsely distributed in the state. And some of those were taken by these old reconnaissance planes, these U-2s and things, really neat vehicles. But of course, because of lack of funding, a lot of those data sets are not digitized. They're not georeferenced, so you don't know exactly where they belong on a map. They're not mosaic together. They're still individual images. So I've put in proposals to try to get those digitized and put into a searchable database and things, and funding has not come through yet, but I think that's a valuable resource for the kind of change detection that you're talking about. Betty here in front.
Are there any constrictions with your research based on our total nights and total days? Does that have any impact on the research that you do?
Yes, I think I learned my lesson about flying in the middle of winter. I had one really good trip on the winter solstice down to Tok. I was taking pictures for my colleague Olga for her book, and because of the winter solstice, because the shadows are so long, all the subsistence trails showed up really nicely, the snow machine and dog sled trails in the snow. And we had pretty good luck. The plane ran and it started again. Our way home it fogged up. We couldn't see anything out the window, but we did another flight a couple years ago around Thanksgiving, and the fuel froze somewhere in the fuel system, and we lost the engine on takeoff, and that was exciting.
So how do you coordinate your astronaut training and your students here, or what you're doing here at the university?
Well, some of the training is experience that I already have. They're asking for at least a private pilot certificate, and some of it's just things that I'll do on my own over the next couple of years, get my scuba, open water, and brush up, get my first aid stuff renewed, and so it's kind of a part-time gig, but I think that'll work pretty well, so I can keep doing my research and flying up here. And anyone who's spent time at Prudhoe probably pretty much already knows what it's like to live at the International Space Station. It's quite a foreign environment in these kind of places. So. Well, if no other questions, I want to thank you all. Oh, we've got. Sorry.
I'm just curious to see if you had any. You did mention about the fuel freezing up and things like that. Have you had any other experiences, like challenging situations where?
Yes. Yes. I'll leave it at that. We've had a few spills, yes.
Congratulations for surviving.
Thanks. Well, so far so good. We'll see.
Well, thank you.
So thanks a lot for coming tonight. All right.
Well, thank you, Dr. Cherry, for coming and speaking with us today. And thank you, everybody, for coming. Coming up tomorrow night, we have Rosies of the North, a film from the National Film Board of Canada here in this building, in this room, actually. And also tomorrow night, we have a concert at the Botanical Gardens. The Frosty Bottoms are playing, so that should be fun.
What time is that?
They're both at 7.
Thank you.
And if anybody would like to spare a moment of their time, we have some surveys that we would like to have filled out so we can gain feedback on our events. So if you'd like to spare some time, that'd be great. I'll be outside with them. Thank you again, Dr.
Thanks
Cherry.
to the organizers and for getting popsicles. A lot of surveys you have time.
Help yourself on the way out. Before they melt, please help me.
No, but I have done some aerobatic training, and that was a lot of fun. It was terrifying, but no. It's good for building confidence, actually. That's why I wanted to do it.
Being taught
I'm trying to show
with both hands on my knees and use the only midwifery, my feet. That was experiential.
Fair enough.
Great.
Thanks.
Fantastic. You're a good speaker.
Well, thanks. I should practice some more.
No, it was really great. Your photos are amazing.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for you.
Great. So you're going to be able to come on Friday?
Yeah, I'm really excited about it.
Good. I'm really glad to have you. Really good to see you guys.
No, it's been a while.
Yeah. I was in Anchorage when you were the house was
Yeah.
You were there.
I was thinking about you yesterday because I've gotten into this podcast called The Organist, and I was listening to it at the gym yesterday, and the whole episode was about rap. And it was like, not like your typical stuff, but it was like, you know, a guy who covered Sir Mix-a-Lot in like emo fashion and then had his version ripped off by Glee and like not acknowledged, and it was
my gosh, that sounds
really
amazing.
funny. Yeah, so I'm gonna have
Did
to like.
Bob love it?
He's gone.
Oh, right. So
Yeah.
he didn't listen.
Yeah.
When does he get back? Thursday?
Hopefully Friday.
Okay.
So just in
in time.
Pretty.
That's fantastic. Where can you listen to that thing?
I'll send you a link. I have a bunch of things for you. I've got all the Nebraska
Oh,
stuff for you.
so
I'm like,
nice.
I haven't seen
So
Rachel.
nice. That was really nice when you said that. I was like, oh, wow, that was so thoughtful. Yeah. Thank you.
It's fun. I've been thinking about you guys. I was on this whole like tour of Nebraska, and
People thought I was nuts when I did that.
oh my god, that's like my dream. I haven't yet done it. I didn't get a chance to
I
do it.
should
on
show you. Oh gosh, they're in Virginia in storage, but photos for my trip.
Yeah.
Will and Catherine Red Cloud. It was fantastic. It was basically like crazy thunder lightning storm.
That's how it was when I was
flew in,
there.
and I was like freaking out. And just as I was pulling into Red Cloud, the clouds parted.
Wow.
And it was like 3 days, beautiful. I was so happy because it was a dream to be on the prairie with the sunset and all of that. And I would have been devastated if it had been rained out.
Yeah, it was like not that nice
Okay.
last week. But
Yeah,
that
I'm very
picture
lucky.
I took,
I
showed it
loved
at the
that photo that you showed at the beginning. It was fantastic.
that was what I just took on this trip, and it was.
Yeah, I wish I had my photos with me. They're
I don't know where any of my
Prairie.
photos in my life are, but yeah, it was totally.
that's beautiful.
These are called like mammoth clouds or something. So it looked like vests, apparently. But there were all kinds of. There were like, I drove from Lincoln all the way out to Shattern and Fort Robinson and Crawford, that area, and I was behind this team of tornado chasers.
Oh gosh, really? Like Bill Paxton and that one.
I don't know what they were. They had like special cars with like weather stations on the top and like tornado chasers ink or something on the side. That's pretty funny.
Wow. Yeah, we'll definitely have to catch up this weekend. That'll be good.
Totally lots of a little stress for your job.
Yeah. Oh, my game. Yeah. You need mental health. You
think we need it really badly. You should just come work at our office.
Yeah, right.
You could use a lot of help from you.
Yeah, I'm just gonna go home now and apply for jobs.
Oh man.
Yeah. I was unemployed for 8 months before I moved to Alaska, and I was just hoping to have a good couple of years of stability. Oh well.
Yeah, the epitome of stability.
Yeah. Everybody's very confident that I'll figure it out. I'm glad they are.
It's always easier, like, I mean, you're employed right now, at least today.
I said I went to go see my mentor, my former supervisor, when I first started here last fall. And he's like, "You're still in holidays. You're just not getting paid for it."
It's always easier to find something when you're at least nominally.
Yeah. So I think the plan right now is I'm going to just keep showing up to work and getting my licensure hours.
It's just so hard on your clients too. What are they going to do?
Yeah. I don't know. That's what's really bothering me is I don't know what's going to happen to them. I'm very worried for our clients. I'm more worried for them than I am for myself.
You're going to find something.
Thank
It
you.
just sucks. Who needs that stress? It's already stressful enough. We'll have a fun time.
You know, I just hope it doesn't get to a point where I have to unexpectedly leave and don't get to terminate appropriately for people. So
Well, sorry, I didn't catch your name.
I would volunteer for nights and weekends or whatever to get to see them and make a plan for them.
Pretty committed. Yeah. It'll be okay. It's not fun though.
Yeah. Oh man. I wish I was licensed. I'd be a heck of a lot more marketable if I was licensed.
How many more hours do you have?
1,500. I have 1,500. I need 1,500 more, so I'm halfway done.
You got all those since September?
Since October, yeah.
October, wow.
Yeah, so
That's intense.
yeah. So we'll see.
Thank you very much for taking the time out.
Yeah.
I really appreciate it. And this will be recorded.
Okay.
So I think it will be up and running on our website to share. So we'll upload it to YouTube. So by the end of the day tomorrow, it should be shareable.
That's good to know.
And there are some popsicles. You didn't get one, so
I'll
would you
totally
like one?
I'll totally do. Thank you.
You're welcome. Sorry, I gave you a hard time. Oh, no. Oh, don't even worry about it. Oh, everybody loves popsicles. I think I went for my own personal reasons. Thank you. You're welcome. Would you guys like to help me out with another popsicle? I'm good. Thank you very much. Somebody's going to help. I think that's the bottom line. Well, thank you very much. And have a good evening.
All right, you too. Oh, really? Oh, that sucks. Okay. Yeah, it probably would have been better to have them almost off, but then people... Yeah, exactly. So I signed you up for next time, Bob. That was me. Yeah, it was. I just wanted to scare you.
Definitely a fun movie.
Yeah.
Alright, did we get the mic off you?
I
guess we didn't really
think
need
this
it.
turns off. Alright, we'll see you guys.
That's really weird.
Yeah.
We'll just pop the batteries out.
Yeah.
It wants to come out. That's so weird. I'll have to mention that to somebody.
Yeah, maybe just put a little sticker on it so you gotta pull the battery out.
Well, it wasn't a gigantic turnout. Oh, I'm curious. Do you know why nobody's gone back to the moon? Is there a reason why we're not going back there? Then we're going everywhere, but we just never go back to, and that's why sometimes I just side with conspiracy theorists just to say, oh, we never went there.
Maybe I have that idea, you know. We've already been to the moon. Let's go tomorrow.
I don't know why they decided that. I know, pretty sad. The Russians are going to try to go in 2 years.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, take care.
So that mic doesn't turn off.
What?
That mic doesn't turn off.
Oh, so you just have to take the battery?
So I just take the battery out and turn it back on bag. I don't let it ring.
Yeah. I closed that because of the weight of the banner, what is this material? Say it, you know it.
I don't know.
Damn it, in British English you call it aluminium. Whatever.
Sorry.
That's fine.
Did you learn British English?
Yes, most of my pronunciation is that, and I have worked over the years to not sound like that. Because I used to say pod and bod.
Oh, yeah. I learned a lot of